Hello, everybody. Welcome back to May I Have a Word. I am author and speaker Caleb Shoemaker, and this is our regular Tuesday look into the daily lectionary. Today is December the 18th. Excuse me, bit of a cough. December the 18th, 2018. We are just 1 week away from Christmas, if you can believe it. Or for those of you on the old calendar, just a couple days away, or just a day away from St. Nicholas Day. So hope you all are excited and ready for that. Something that's always really special for our family is St. Nicholas Day. My kids really love it. And I'm trying to work on the lighting here. I had it all figured out the other day, but I'm in a dark spot right now. So we're just going to go with it. It's going to be great. Because if I turn the light too much, then it gets right in my glasses, which is awkward. But that's going to be fixed in a couple weeks when we get contacts. So let's take a look. So get your Bible. I'm using the Orthodox Study Bible. This is Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 12. Remember that the messages in the gospel reading leading up to the Nativity, especially for those of us in the East, are not the same kind of like preparing for a baby to be born kind of messages that you see during Advent readings in the West. Advent in the East is about preparing for the coming of the King who will be revealed as God at the Theophany. So there's coming judgment. There's final teachings of Jesus. There's hard sayings of Jesus as we prepare our hearts, as we prepare our minds, as we prepare our houses for the coming of the King and the return and the coming of Christ. Not just as innocent baby in manger, but as King and Judge. So Mark chapter 2, the Pharisees came to him and asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Testing him. And he answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Because of the hardness of your heart, he wrote this precept. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate." In the house, his disciples also asked him about the same matter. So he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery against him." As I said, hard sayings of Jesus today. So let's take a look at this passage as we understand it, because it appears in Mark's Gospel, it appears in Matthew's Gospel, and a similar passage appears in Luke's Gospel. It's one of the synoptic teachings of Jesus. We don't see it in John, and that's not uncommon to see those harder teachings of Jesus are different. They're different hard in St. John's Gospel than they are in the synoptic Gospels. Remember, we're talking about Jesus as the judge. Jesus is the arbiter of the law. So the first thing to keep in mind is that Jesus has been teaching and speaking with authority. Read through Mark's Gospel again, starting in chapter 2 when Jesus begins to do his earthly ministry. People are surprised because nobody teaches with this kind of authority, not even the teachers of the law. Almost as if they're afraid to speak too much for whatever reason. And yet Jesus comes speaking and teaching the law with authority. Take a look at the way Luke's Gospel opens up in chapter 4. Jesus opens up the scroll, he turns to Isaiah, and he says, "Today, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing." Preaching with authority. Jesus commands demons to leave. He forgives sin. He's speaking with authority. So the Pharisees, and I think out of jealousy, but remember the Pharisees are the ones who are the keepers of the law. They know the law of Moses forward and backward. They have precept upon precept stacked together so that you can't transgress. You know that you're doing the right thing, you're in right standing with God, you're righteous and holy because you've kept the law. How do you know you've kept the commandments? This is how. Which is fantastic if that's what you're looking to do. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But for them, Jesus is teaching with an authority that even they don't profess. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, bracket, by your religious leaders, X. But I say to you, Y. Even about divorce. You have heard it said, give your wife a certificate of divorce and send her away. But I say to you this. So this is a touchy point. Jesus is teaching with authority, and so the Pharisees come to test him. They're not really interested in what he has to say about the topic, so long as they might be able to catch him in just the right place. And this happens all the time. This is not like, teacher, what is the greatest commandment? Teacher, who is my neighbor? If a man has 7 wives, that's one of my favorites, because if you don't have the whole Old Testament, if you don't read Maccabees, then you don't know that it's kind of a gag. There's a man with 7 wives, or a woman who has 7 husbands. In Maccabees, 7 men have her to raise up a child for their brother. It's a logic puzzle. It's a joke that you tell at parties to try and get to trip up your friends. So Jesus is doing this. They're doing the same thing here. Lord Master, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And Mark tells us, testing him. And this is important because Jesus' answer is not, to the Pharisees, is not straightforward. He forces them to make an answer. He forces them to think for themselves. And so what does he say? His first response, and this is exactly what he says to the lawyer in the other passage about which is the greatest commandment. What does the law say, and what is your understanding of it? So he does the same thing. They're the Pharisees. They're the ones who know the law. They put their faith in the law. They're trusting that their righteousness, their holiness, their keeping of the commandments is going to keep them on the blessing side of blessings and curses. And so they tell him, Moses permits a man to write his wife a certificate of divorce. Which is true. Read through Deuteronomy. Moses allows the Israelites to write a certificate of divorce and divorce their wives. And by this time, the Pharisees the rabbis had to determine what was acceptable divorce and what wasn't. What was the reasonable thing to write a divorce certificate for and which weren't. So this is a direct challenge to Jesus about the authority of the Pharisees to interpret the law of Moses. And so Jesus doesn't play into the trap. He simply makes a statement. It's because of the hardness of your hearts that precept was written. And then before they even have a chance to interrupt him, he says, wait a minute, think about it. At the beginning, this is not the way it was. In the beginning, God made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So what God has turned into one thing, don't surgically remove. And it doesn't matter if you're allowed. Think bigger picture. Think kingdom thinking. Think the way things are meant to be. And I think we need to get this through our minds here, especially when we look at the coming of Christ and the Nativity. Christ is coming to restore the image that was lost at the beginning. And so these in the beginning comments that Jesus makes in his teachings in the Gospels here are really significant. If, as our hymns teach us, if we sang them on Saturday night, Christ is coming to restore the image lost at the beginning, then Jesus is, of course, going to pull the Pharisees back to the garden. He's going to pull them back to that place where right standing was had with God. And the worry about the commandments was less, because the commandments were really straightforward. Keep the garden and don't eat from that tree. Be fruitful and multiply, eat from the garden, and don't eat from that tree. And that was basically it. So I think when you've got something like this teaching that they've finessed to a fine point about Moses' teachings on divorce, Jesus goes back to the start. Jesus goes back to the beginning. He goes back to the place where everything was the way it was supposed to be. And in the story, and this is good, and I won't belabor the point, but in rabbinical teaching, Talmudic teaching, the man created in Genesis 1 is male and female. It's hermaphrodite, male and female, and God removes the other half. The word for rib is often also used for the side of a tent, so that God takes woman out of the half man, and takes the single unit and turns them into two, and then brings them together as one flesh, returns them together again, two individuals becoming one whole again. And so Jesus is playing a little bit with us, I think. If I'm not being too off the mark here, I think he's helping them see through the lens of their own teachings what it is about divorce that's so bothersome. And I think a big thing that makes I think a big thing that makes this teaching so challenging for the disciples, because of course in Matthew's gospel, um, the disciples say to Jesus, "Well, then, Lord, like this is really hard. How could anyone do this? If I couldn't get divorced, why would I get married?" Is kind of their nudge here, and Jesus has the same basic teaching. It's not about convenience. It's not about an escape clause. If you truly understood marriage as a picture of the divine union, as a picture of the Holy Trinity, then what part would you cut out? St. Paul will go on this later on in Corinthians. Think about the body. Can the foot say, because I'm not a hand, I'm not part of the body? Well, if the whole body were a hand, where would the walking be? And he goes on and on, these kind of ridiculous raising tricholia. And I think Jesus is doing a similar thing here with this message. They're not thinking about the significance of the marriage union, and they're not thinking of it as an icon of the relationship between God and man that you see brought about. Paul really focuses on in the Corinthians passage. So for Moses at the time of the Israelites, the time of the Exodus, he allows them to divorce their wives because they already have this hardness. They already have this hardness in their heart. There's already divisions among them, and there's this understanding of allowing this less than ideal situation on the understanding that we're going to the promised land, and the going to the promised land is the beginning of the inbreaking of God's kingdom, which will culminate in the coming of Christ. And so Jesus is telling the Pharisees here, you're thinking the wrong direction. You're thinking too much about this temporal plane, and you're not seeing marriage for what it really is. Because this is a test. They're trying to trick him. They're trying to say, he's teaching directly against the law of Moses. And he doesn't do that. What he does say is that marriage is more than just a physical or legal union between two individuals. Marriage is a spiritual union. It's an icon of the Trinity. It's an icon of the relationship between God and man. And when God created man and woman, he made them from two to be one. And if God has joined something together as one, don't separate it. Which is something that, of course, the Pharisees would understand. God is one. Husband and wife are one. This is all part of the faith tradition that Jesus is speaking out of. So when the apostles ask him about it later, like, Lord, and again in Matthew's gospel we hear they say, Lord, this is really hard. Who can obey this teaching? He's a little more subtle in Matthew. If anyone divorces his wife for anything other than sexual immorality, he commits adultery. Mark, Jesus is straight to the point. If you divorce your wife, you commit adultery, and you marry another, you commit adultery. If a woman divorces her husband, she marries another, she commits adultery. And for Jesus, it's in this Markan gospel, in this Markan pericope, Jesus is being very specific about the nature of marriage, and that it is a mystical union between two people. So which part would you cut off? Could you remove half yourself and let it marry somebody else? Jesus is saying no. And that's the Markan gospel. And I think this is where, leading into the 1 week now from Nativity, we're going to see the coming of the bridegroom in the birth of Christ, who will eventually wed himself to the church on the cross, cleaving, being held, nailed to the cross, cleaving to his wife, cleaving to his bride, whom he will rescue from death. And it's a union with Christ that we receive as a result of that. The Holy Spirit comes to dwell in us. And though he's not saying it outright, I think there's something to Mark's description of marriage at the beginning in the garden is a foreshadowing of the coming of the final marriage between Christ and the church at the end of all times. And that is, how would you separate that? If it's a mystical union where the Spirit of Christ indwells us and we dwell in him, what part would you cut out? How could you do that? Could you cut yourself off from the church? Could you cut yourself off from Christ? Could you cut yourself off from the relationship with Christ? If the Spirit of God is dwelling in all things, present everywhere, living in all things, how would you cut that off? Anyway, that is our daily reading today from Mark's Gospel. I hope you have a blessed feast coming up. I won't be doing a Christmas Day message. I've got other things going on Christmas Day, but for those of you who are celebrating Christmas Day on the 25th, may God bless you richly in the Nativity of Christ. And those of you who are still waiting another few days, may the remaining time of your fast prepare your heart and your soul for the coming of the Lord.